So hi, church. We are back for another video in our Midweek Encouragement video series. And I have with me today my good friend, Mr. Zachary Peaches Sewell.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be part of this. So I don't know all the questions Gilbert's going to ask, but I think I only know one question he's going to ask. So,
well, I have to ask this one because there's a lot of people. I mean, you grew up at this church, and so longtime missional partners will know that you're Peaches and maybe why. But I'm sure there's a lot of people that don't know that you go by the name Peaches sometimes, and why that would be your name. So why don't you share the story? Why are you Peaches?
a lot of people do call me Peaches, especially people who are friends with my mom. When I was a toddler, all the way up until I was probably 6, 7, 8 years old, one of my favorite snacks was peaches, and my mom would, get peaches out for me and I would eat them. And then when I was in elementary school, we went on a field trip to the zoo, and my mom was one of the parent chaperones to go. And while I was there, I rode a camel. That was one of the activities you could do. And the camel's name was Peaches. And so according to my mom, that is why she just started calling me Peaches, because I like to eat peaches and I rode a camel named Peaches. And so that's the whole story. And so I should embellish it a little bit and make,
Yeah, I was going to say, I was expecting a birthmark that looks like a peach, or maybe your baby bottom was as cute as a peach or something like that.
No, I think it was more the camel.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, it's stuck, and we call you that at the office occasionally. So.
Yeah, and Carl Jemison, I remember several years ago, the first time I preached at Overland Park, he liked to say "Peaches preaches." That was something that he got into.
All right. Well, you and I are lunch buddies. We eat out for lunch quite often together.
Yeah, not lately.
Not lately. Kind of bummed about that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of places that are probably pretty close to going out of business because of our lack of.
Because we're not there. Yeah.
Because we're not there.
That's right.
So I want to set up a scenario. Say we go to Firehouse Subs.
Mm-hmm.
You place your order. You tell them what you want on your sandwich, and you want chips and a drink. And at the end, they say, "Would you like a pickle spear with that?" What's your answer?
I not only do not want to eat the pickle spear, but I do not want it on my plate either. And so I ask them to not. I don't ever want the pickle spear to be on my plate. Sometimes I can deal with it if they leave it on there. And I think when you and I have gone, I just put it onto your plate. And but no, I prefer that a pickle does not. I prefer a pickle not come within close proximity of my food.
There have been a few small moments where you've shared that pickle with me, but most of the time you just say no.
Right.
And then my feelings are hurt that you didn't say, "I don't want it, but you can give it to my friend."
Yeah. I guess, honestly, I care more about there being no risk that it ever be on my plate than I care about you having a second pickle. So.
Because I could chow down on a second pickle.
Yeah. The pickle thing has been, I'm not sure why, but a lot of people at church have really grabbed onto that. Especially, I've been the victim of many pranks surrounding my dislike of pickles. And Carla Sackmar, who has worked in the office for many years, and Teresa have been behind a lot of these pranks. One time, Teresa replaced some chips that I was keeping in the kitchen area in the office with pickle flavored chips. And so I just ate right into those. That was gross. And another time, this was a few years ago, I was sitting in my office and I just kept thinking, what is that smell? I just kept smelling something. I went to the main office and they couldn't smell it. And then finally, a few people were watching, because I guess I knew something was up, and I was looking around my office, and I found what was a used but empty pickle container that Carla Sackmar she had been at Firehouse Subs, ironically, and they had said, she had asked them, can I have that empty pickle bucket? I guess they just come in the bucket there, all those spears. And so they gave it to her. And of course, she didn't wash it out or anything. And she just hid it in my office somewhere. And so my office smelled like pickles really bad. But I still do stuff to her sometimes. Like she's afraid of a movie character from from the movie Halloween, that guy who wears the mask. So
That's actually a great segue into my next question: movies. I
Yeah.
know you're a movie guy.
I do like movies.
I'm sure you've watched plenty of movies during this stay-at-home thing.
Mm-hmm.
What character do you most imagine yourself being like in this pandemic that we're going through right now? Like this, the world's scared, they're full of anxiety, everybody's staying home. Like, what character do you imagine yourself being in the midst of all this?
Oh man, that's a tough one. You know, when I texted you yesterday and said, what questions are you going to ask? That was not on there.
I just came up with this one about 10 minutes ago.
Okay, so Jerry Seinfeld, that's not my answer. Jerry Seinfeld, in his stand-up comedy one time, said that every man doesn't just see superheroes when he's growing up or when he's old, in movies as something to like look up to or something to aspire to or something like that. He says that for guys, these aren't just characters, these are options. And I have always I've always admired Batman the most. And so I guess if I were going to be anyone during this pandemic, it would be Batman, especially because he, operates well at night. And since you're not really supposed to be out anytime, really, but under night, he's pretty good at being, kind of obscure and hiding and sneaking around in corners and stuff. I'm not sure what Batman could possibly do to help this, except maybe send people home and tell people in his Batman voice, go home. And so that would be it.
Are you Lego Batman? Are you Clooney Batman? Are you
not Clooney, not Lego? My favorite Batman. In fact, I would say the only Batman recently that really should be in the last 20 years that should be considered to be really part of the Batman canon would be the Dark Knight trilogy Batman from the Christopher Nolan movies. Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises. Those are the more serious Batman movies and the movies that should be watched first if you've never seen Batman. I would say nothing against Ben Affleck's most recent Batman, but just skip over it. Christopher Nolan is a masterful storyteller, introduces the story of Batman very well with Batman Begins, and then Heath Ledger's Joker in The Dark Knight brings in a very worthy villain for Batman. And then, of course, Tom Hardy's Bane in The Dark Knight Rises is a very imposing physical challenge for Batman. In fact, he ends up breaking Batman in that movie, so like literally breaking him. And so very interesting story. I would definitely recommend the Dark Knight trilogy if you haven't seen it. And yeah, I would say the world could use Batman in the streets right now to send people home.
I don't know how to segue from that into a serious question. So
I would say there's probably no good way to segue from that into a serious question.
So I'm just going to do it. Kind of closing out, just kind of thinking this week, what's something that you would like to say to our church this week that might be of encouragement or comfort?
Yeah, it is tough to segue, isn't it? Because this question is the one I knew you were going to ask, and that was what was on my mind when we first got onto Zoom, and I thought you were going to get straight into it. And so it is tough to go from that. And so, but here is what I would say, really, like putting all that goofy stuff aside, is that I would encourage myself and everyone, really, to think about the time in Jesus' life when he was vulnerable to isolation. And specifically, I'm thinking about you can either go and read the beginning of Matthew chapter 4 or the beginning of Luke chapter 4. And in either one of those, we see Jesus's temptation episode. And a lot of times when we read about Jesus's temptation, we focus on the temptations themselves, at least the temptations that the gospel writers have given us, which I believe there were a lot more during that 40-day period. However, what I want to focus on right now is that season of isolation for Jesus was a season. It was 40 days. And it wasn't just, we can breeze right past that, but there's this movie called Last Days in the Desert. And it's kind of interesting because Ian McGregor portrays both Jesus and Satan in the movie. And what that movie does a really good job of, and you don't even have to watch the whole movie to get this. You can just go onto YouTube right now and type in Last Days in the Desert trailer and watch just the 2.5-minute trailer. And the trailer itself does a good job of conveying portraying just the length of time that Jesus was in the wilderness, vulnerable to temptation. And we need to remember that one of the reasons Jesus was vulnerable during that time to the things that Satan was presenting to him was isolation. We have no record of other people being around, except at the very end it mentions angels being there attending to Jesus after the temptations were complete. But as far as we know, it was Jesus and Satan. And when I talk about Jesus being vulnerable, that can be off-putting to some people because we don't like to think about Jesus actually being vulnerable to Satan's ideas or actually entertaining Satan's ideas. But we need to remember that the Hebrew writer tells us that Jesus suffered through his temptations in life. And we need to remember Jesus, even though the Hebrew writer tells us he was tempted in every way, yet was definitely without sin, he was definitely tempted. And that's something that we need to think about. And we need to, so getting back to the main point I was making, is that during this time, I think it's important for us to remember that Jesus too knows what it's like to be in isolation. And the last thing I'd like to say about that is that we shouldn't confuse Jesus's time in isolation with Jesus's time that he often spent in solitude away from other people, but with his Father, because we see the gospel writers make a point to show the pattern that Jesus had of continually getting away from the crowds and finding a place. And also not just when he wanted prayer time, but when he wanted grieving time as well. After he learned that his friend and cousin John the Baptist had been murdered in prison, his response is to withdraw by boat to a solitary place. Jesus, being human, needed to process his grief. And so he had a rhythm of moving through life, seeking out solitude when he needed it, and seeking out time with God when he needed it. However, I believe he also experienced isolation in the wilderness during those 40 days. I think that was part of the point, because Jesus experienced a lot of things we experience, so why should he be immune to the human experience of isolation? And so the final thing I want to say about that is that remember that isolation puts us at risk. Isolation put Jesus at risk. I believe there was a lot on the line during those temptation episodes, and Jesus, even though he did not sin, was definitely at risk of sinning. If there was no chance that Jesus was actually going to give in, then this whole thing doesn't matter, because of course there was a chance Jesus was going to give in, but he did not sin. That's the main thing. And so if there was no chance he was ever going to give in, then he was just being puppeted and wasn't a real human. But he was a real human, and that's what's important to remember. So isolation puts us at risk, just like it put Jesus at risk, but Jesus handled it without sin. We don't handle it without sin very often. I believe that isolation drives most of us into a greater vulnerability of surrendering to sin. I was reading the other day about how during the COVID-19 pandemic alone, pornography consumption worldwide has increased by something like 20%. And that was like 2 weeks ago that I was reading that. And I think it was still increasing. And so that's a lot more people around the globe accessing pornography on a regular basis because of various things having to do with this pandemic. And so definitely puts us more at risk. And so isolation puts us at risk. Solitude can be beneficial. And so I believe that Jesus experienced both things. He experienced the isolation, even though he didn't necessarily want to experience the isolation, but he sought out solitude. But solitude serves a purpose. And he always went from solitude back to being with the people who he was friends with, to the people he was ministering to the people who looked up to him, and just back into community in general. And so I would encourage all of us to think about, what are we doing with this time? Because we can definitely isolate ourselves, even if we're physically around other people in a house or around family. I mean, people live in isolation when they live in close proximity to hundreds of thousands of people. So are we treating this time as a time of isolation? Are we isolating ourselves emotionally from those who we shouldn't be isolating ourselves emotionally? Or are we benefiting from some solitude? And the other way of thinking about this is, if there's no isolation or there's no solitude at all during this time, because we're in a house and we're not used to these rhythms, or we're not used to staying at home, could we at least create a little bit of time for solitude and try to find, and not just for you, but for everyone in the house, try to find little corners of the day where you can have even 5 minutes more, if you can find it, of solitude a day, and just pray the sinner's prayer, pray the Lord's prayer, pray the prayer of St. Francis, pray nothing but just be, and allow God to just try to be with you. And so, or try to sense God's presence is how I should phrase it. And so that's what I would say, is just remember, Jesus too was vulnerable to isolation. However, Jesus sought out solitude for a purpose. And so we should seek out solitude, but for the purpose of coming back into some form of community. And if you do feel isolated right now, think of practical things you can do, whether it be connecting with the church family in a way you haven't been, joining in the Zoom rooms that are offered 4 times a week, thinking about what does your link offer specifically, things like that.
Cool. Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I think that's going to be some good guidance for some people.
Cool.
That the difference between isolation and solitude, I think, is a good point.